Have you ever wondered what separated a seasoned warrior from someone who was about to die on the battlefield? What invisible thread connected life and death in the chaos of war? And how could one man, standing in the smoke and thunder of combat, look at another soldier hundreds of yards away and know, with absolute certainty, that this person would not survive the next 5 minutes? Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching this from, and please subscribe to this channel. We need your help to keep bringing you this secret content that most people will never hear about. Your support makes all the difference. In the spring of 1943, deep within the training grounds of Fort Huachuca, Arizona, something extraordinary was taking place. The United States Army had begun recruiting men from the Apache nations, Chiricahua, Mescalero, and Jicarilla tribes, men whose ancestors had fought the longest guerrilla war in American history. These recruits were not being trained as ordinary infantrymen. They were being molded into something the modern military had never seen before: battlefield observers who could read the language of combat itself. The program was classified. Its existence was buried in paperwork that used mundane titles like Special Reconnaissance Training Initiative and Indigenous Tactics Integration Program. But those who witnessed what these men could do understood they were watching something that defied conventional military doctrine. They were watching warriors who could see what others could not. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ashford, a veteran of the North African campaign, had been assigned to oversee the program. In his private journal, later discovered in the National Archives in 1998, he wrote, "I have served with British commandos, French Foreign Legion, and the toughest sons of bitches the Marines could produce. None of them see what these Apache men see. It's as if they're reading a book written in a language the rest of us don't even know exists." The key to their ability, Ashford noted, was not some mystical sixth sense or Hollywood fantasy. It was observation refined to an art form that most modern soldiers had forgotten. While conventional training taught men to look for movement, muzzle flash, and obvious tactical errors, the Apache scouts looked for something far more subtle. They looked for fear. Corporal Thomas Naich, a 24-year-old Mescalero Apache from the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico, explained the principle to his training group in June of 1943. His words were recorded in a training manual that was never officially published, but circulated among special operations units for decades. An amateur shooter makes the gun do what he wants. A professional shooter becomes part of the gun. You can see the difference in how they move, how they hold themselves, how they breathe. An amateur is fighting the weapon. A professional is dancing with it. The difference, Nietzsche explained, showed itself in dozens of microscopic ways. An amateur's rifle barrel would tremble, just slightly, as they aimed. A professional's would be still as stone. An amateur would shift their weight repeatedly, trying to find comfort in an uncomfortable position. A professional would sink into position like water finding its level. An amateur would fire, then immediately move their head to see if they hit their target. A professional would stay absolutely motionless, already calculating the next shot. But the most telling sign, the one that the Apache scouts learned to identify across distances that seemed impossible, was in the moments before the shot. An amateur shooter, Nietzsche explained, would tense their entire body just before pulling the trigger. This tension would ripple through their frame, creating minute movements that disturbed the natural stillness of their surroundings. A professional, by contrast, would relax completely in the instant before firing, becoming so still that they nearly disappeared into the landscape. These principles were put to the test in the mountains of Italy in late 1943, when elements of the 3rd Infantry Division began their brutal push through the winter line. Sergeant Daniel Geronimo, a 31-year-old Chiricahua Apache from Arizona, was attached to a reconnaissance unit tasked with locating German sniper positions in the hills above Monte Cassino. The German snipers had been devastating. For 3 weeks they had picked off American officers, radio operators, and medics with impunity. Counter-sniper teams had been deployed repeatedly, with minimal success. The Germans were too well hidden, too disciplined, too patient. Every time American forces thought they had located a sniper nest, they would find it empty, the enemy having moved to a new position hours before. Geronimo approached the problem differently. Instead of looking for the snipers themselves, he looked for the men who would get killed next. On his first day of observation, positioned on a ridge overlooking the American advance positions, he identified 7 soldiers in his own battalion who, in his assessment, were marked for death. His report to Captain William Hartford was precise. Private Jenkins, 3rd Platoon, takes his helmet off to wipe sweat every 45 minutes, always in the same spot, always at the same time. German sniper watching him, waiting for pattern to confirm. Jenkins dies if he does it again. Corporal Morrison, 2nd Platoon, stands up too straight when he moves between positions. Doesn't bend at the waist. Thinks ducking his head is enough. German sniper already ranged the path he takes. Morrison dies if he uses that path again. Lieutenant Andrews, 1st Platoon, smokes cigarettes facing west every evening at 1700 hours. Stands in exact same position. Hand goes up to mouth, same way every time. German sniper sees the lighter flame. Andrews dies next time he lights a cigarette there. Hartford was skeptical but desperate. He ordered all 7 men confined to different positions and briefed on Geronimo's observations. None of them were allowed to repeat their patterns. 3 days later, a new soldier, a replacement who had just arrived from the States, stood up in exactly the position where Corporal Morrison usually moved. The shot came from 800 meters away, striking the replacement in the chest. He died instantly. The location of the muzzle flash was noted. American artillery obliterated the position within minutes. When a patrol investigated the site the next morning, they found a carefully constructed sniper nest with a logbook written in German. The last entry, dated the previous day, translated roughly to American corporal, recognizable by his walk, eliminated. Position compromised. Moving to secondary observation point. The German sniper had killed the wrong man, but only because Corporal Morrison had been warned. The sniper had been so certain of his target that he had fired without confirming the identity. It was, Hartford realized, the first mistake the German sniper had made, and it had been forced by Geronimo's intervention. Word of Geronimo's abilities spread quickly. Within weeks, he was being requested by multiple units along the Italian front. His method, commanders discovered, was teachable to a degree. He could show other soldiers what to look for, help them understand the subtle tells that separated the marked from the unmarked. But the speed and certainty with which he made his assessments seemed impossible to replicate. In his own words, recorded in a debriefing conducted in March of 1944, Geronimo described his process. I watch how men carry their fear. Everyone is afraid in combat. That's not weakness. That's intelligence. But some men carry their fear in ways that make them visible. They make themselves into targets by trying too hard not to be targets. They move wrong. They hold themselves wrong. They watch wrong. An amateur thinks staying still means being safe, so they freeze. But when they freeze, they stop breathing naturally. Their chest stops moving right. Their shoulders lock up. From a distance, they look like a statue someone placed in a war. They stand out because they're trying too hard to blend in. A professional knows that being still means being relaxed. They breathe deep and slow. They let their body sink into whatever cover they're using. They become part of the earth, part of the wall. part of the rubble. They don't try to be invisible. They just stop being visible. The distinction seemed philosophical, almost poetic, but its application was ruthlessly practical. By April of 1944, Geronimo had personally identified and corrected the behavior of over 60 American soldiers who were, in his assessment, about to be killed by German snipers. Of those 60, 53 were later confirmed to have been under active observation by enemy sharpshooters based on captured German documents and interrogations of prisoners. But the program expanded beyond individual survival. The Apache observers began to be used offensively to identify not just amateur American soldiers, but amateur German ones. The principle, it turned out, worked in both directions. Corporal James Cochise, a 26-year-old Jicarilla Apache from New Mexico, was attached to a unit preparing for the D-Day invasion in the spring of 1944. His assignment was unusual. He was to observe German defensive positions from aerial reconnaissance photographs and identify which enemy soldiers were most likely to be inexperienced, which positions were most likely to break under pressure, and which defensive sectors could be exploited. His analysis was detailed and disturbing. Looking at hundreds of photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft, Cochise identified patterns in how German soldiers positioned themselves in their defensive works. The professionals, he noted, positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire, with natural cover at their backs, with multiple routes of egress. The amateurs clustered together in the same positions, faced the same directions, and created what Cochise called dead zones of observation, areas they simply weren't watching because they didn't understand how to position themselves correctly. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, several of Cochise's predictions were confirmed with horrifying accuracy. At Omaha Beach, in the sectors he had identified as manned by inexperienced defenders, American forces found German positions that had collapsed not due to overwhelming firepower, but due to poor positioning that left entire defensive works vulnerable to flanking attacks the defenders never saw coming. In one particular case, a German machine gun nest that had been photographed extensively before the invasion was captured intact by American Rangers, who approached from an angle the defenders had left completely unobserved. Inside the position, the Rangers found 6 dead German soldiers, all aged between 18 and 20 years old, and a diary belonging to the position commander. The last entry, dated June 5th, read, "The men are afraid. They have never seen combat. I have tried to show them how to watch all approaches, but they only watch where they expect the enemy to come from. I fear we are not ready for what is coming." The position commander had understood the problem. He had known his men were amateurs, but he had not known how to fix it in time. And Cochise, looking at a photograph taken from 8,000 feet in the air, had identified the exact flaw in their defensive posture, the exact angle they weren't watching, the exact mistake that would kill them. As the war in Europe progressed, the Apache observation program grew in scope and sophistication. By the winter of 1944, 12 Apache soldiers were operating across the European theater, attached to various combat units as special observers. Their casualty identification rates, the percentage of soldiers they flagged as vulnerable who were later confirmed to have been under enemy observation, remained above 80%. But something else was happening. Something that began to trouble the officers who worked most closely with these men. The Apache observers were not just identifying amateur soldiers. They were identifying something deeper, something that military doctrine had no language to describe. In November of 1944, Sergeant Thomas Naicha, the same man who had helped develop the training program at Fort Huachuca, was operating with the 28th Infantry Division in the Hurtgen Forest. The forest had become a nightmare of close-quarters combat. where visibility was measured in yards, and death came from trees, foxholes, and booby traps hidden in the mud and snow. Naiche's reports from the Hurtgen were different from his earlier assessments. Instead of identifying individual soldiers at risk, he began reporting on entire units. His language became more abstract, more difficult for his commanders to parse. "3rd Platoon, Baker Company," he wrote in a report dated November 21st, "is already dead. The men don't know it yet, but they're already dead. They move like ghosts who forgot they're ghosts. No awareness of space, no connection to each other. They're not a unit anymore. They're just individuals who happen to be in the same place. Germans will kill them all in the next engagement." His commander, Major Kenneth Bradley, demanded clarification. How could Naiche know this? What specifically had he observed? Naiche's response was recorded in Bradley's personal log. "I can't explain it in words you'll understand. They've stopped being alive in the way that keeps you alive in combat. They're going through motions, following orders, but there's nothing behind their eyes anymore. The forest has already taken them. The bullets just haven't arrived yet." 3 days later, during an attack on a German pillbox, 3rd Platoon of Baker Company was annihilated. 42 men entered the assault. 3 survived. The after-action report described poor tactical coordination, inadequate artillery support, and unexpectedly strong enemy resistance. But Major Bradley wrote in his personal journal, "Naiche knew. He fucking knew. 3 days before it happened, he knew. How?" The question haunted Bradley for the rest of his life. In letters he wrote to his wife, preserved now in the archives at the Army War College, he struggled to articulate what he had witnessed. "These Apache men see things we don't see. It's not about enemy positions or tactical analysis. It's something else. It's like they can see the strings that connect cause and effect, like they can see the pattern of what's going to happen before it happens. And it terrifies me, because if they can see death coming for others, can they see it coming for themselves?" The answer to that question came in the cold darkness of December 1944, during the opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching American forces completely off guard. In the chaos of the initial assault, communication broke down across multiple divisions. Units were cut off, surrounded, or simply disappeared into the snow and fog. The carefully planned defensive lines collapsed in hours. Sergeant Daniel Geronimo was attached to the 106th Infantry Division, positioned in what would become the center of the German assault. On the morning of December 15th, less than 24 hours before the attack began, Geronimo filed a report that his commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, initially dismissed as impossible. The report stated, "Enemy offensive imminent. Large-scale assault planned within 24 to 48 hours. Recommend immediate defensive preparations and repositioning of artillery assets." When Colonel Harrison asked how Geronimo could possibly know this, given that Allied intelligence had detected no signs of a pending German attack, Geronimo's response was documented in the division's war diary. "The Germans across from us are acting wrong. They're too still, too quiet. It's not the stillness of defenders waiting. It's the stillness of hunters holding their breath before the strike." Professional soldiers preparing for action have a different energy than professional soldiers in defensive positions. I can see it in how they move when they think we're not watching. They're coiling up, not settling in. Colonel Harrison elevated the report to division headquarters, but it was given little credence. The prevailing intelligence assessment was that German forces were too depleted to launch any significant offensive. Geronimo's observation-based warning was filed away as interesting but unactionable. 20 hours later, at 05:30 on the morning of December 16th, German artillery began raining down on American positions throughout the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In the first 72 hours of combat, the 106th Infantry Division suffered catastrophic losses. Entire battalions were overrun or surrendered. Colonel Harrison was killed on the second day of fighting when a German tank column appeared on a road his intelligence officers had assured him was clear. Of the 12 Apache observers who had been deployed to the European theater, 4 died during the Battle of the Bulge, 3 were captured, and 5 survived. Sergeant Daniel Geronimo was among the survivors, but barely. He spent 6 days behind German lines, moving at night through the frozen forests, evading enemy patrols. When he finally reached American lines on December 22nd, frost-bitten and half-starved, he carried with him something that would change how military intelligence understood battlefield observation. In his pack was a small notebook, filled with observations he had made during his time behind enemy lines. The notebook, now preserved in the National Archives Military Records Division, contains 37 pages of detailed notes on German troop movements, equipment conditions, and, most significantly, assessments of enemy morale and training levels based purely on observational analysis. One entry, dated December 19th, reads, "Observed German infantry company, approximately 120 men, moving south on unmarked forest road. 60% of soldiers show signs of recent conscription. Poor weapons discipline, inadequate winter equipment, visible confusion during officer briefings. This company is marked. American counterattack in this sector will break them easily. However, 20 soldiers in this group are from a different unit, integrated as stiffening element. These men are professionals, Eastern Front veterans. They will fight hard, and they will know when to withdraw. Mark these 20 for elimination first, or they will rally the rest." 3 days later, American forces launched a counterattack in the exact sector Geronimo had observed. The after-action report noted that enemy resistance collapsed rapidly, except for a corps of approximately 15 to 20 soldiers who fought with exceptional discipline and nearly allowed the enemy company to execute an organized withdrawal. American forces suffered higher casualties than expected, specifically due to this small group of professional soldiers. The question that emerged from Geronimo's survival and his observations was profound. If these Apache scouts could identify which enemy soldiers were professionals and which were amateurs, could they also predict which enemy units would hold and which would break? Could they identify, from observation alone, which soldiers had the psychological and physical training to maintain combat effectiveness under extreme stress? The answer, documented across dozens of after-action reports and intelligence assessments from late 1944 and early 1945, was yes. But it came with a disturbing corollary. The same men who could identify weakness in the enemy were acutely aware of weakness in their own units, and they could see what their commanders often could not or would not admit. They could see when their own men were breaking. Corporal Thomas Nietzsche, operating in the Hurtgen forest throughout December and January, kept a separate, personal journal that was discovered decades later among his effects after his death in 2003. In it, he documented not just enemy positions or tactical observations, but his own growing unease about what he was being asked to do. "They want me to tell them who's going to die," he wrote on January 4th, 1945. "That's what it comes down to. They phrase it differently. They ask me to identify soldiers who need additional training, who need to be reassigned to safer positions, who need to be watched more carefully. But what they're really asking is, who's going to die next? And I can tell them. I can look at a man and know if he's going to survive the next engagement." But what they don't understand is that by asking me to identify these men, they're making me carry their deaths. Every time I point to a soldier and say, "He's marked," I'm marking him. Even if I'm right, even if I save his life by getting him moved to a different position, I've marked him. He knows I saw death on him, and that knowledge changes him. This psychological dimension of the Apache observation program was never formally addressed in official military documentation, but it appears repeatedly in personal letters, journals, and post-war testimonies. The Apache scouts were not just identifying tactical vulnerabilities. They were identifying men who had internally surrendered, who had given up hope of survival, who were going through the motions of combat without the psychological resilience necessary to stay alive. And the terrible truth, documented in classified debriefings conducted after the war, was that this identification was a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because the scouts cursed the men they identified, but because the men they identified had already cursed themselves. They had already decided, at some unconscious level, that they were going to die. The scouts were simply seeing what the men themselves had not yet consciously admitted. By March of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Apache observation program had expanded to include psychological warfare applications. If scouts could identify amateur enemy soldiers from a distance, could they exploit this identification to break enemy morale? Could they use their observational skills not just defensively, to protect American soldiers, but offensively, to target the psychological weak points in enemy formations? The experiment was conducted in the Rhineland during the final months of the European War. Corporal James Cochise, the same man who had analyzed German defenses before D-Day, was given an unusual assignment: observe German defensive positions and identify which enemy soldiers, if killed, would cause maximum psychological damage to their units. Not officers, necessarily, but soldiers whose presence held units together through force of personality or example. Cochise's analysis was chilling in its precision. He identified soldiers who, from his observation, served as informal leaders, men whom other soldiers watched and imitated, men whose behavior set the standard for their squads. He then recommended these men be specifically targeted by American snipers or precision artillery fire. The results were documented in classified intelligence reports that remained sealed until 1997. In 3 separate engagements, German defensive positions that intelligence had assessed as strongly held collapsed far more rapidly than expected after specific soldiers within those positions were killed in what appeared to be random combat incidents. Post-battle interrogations of German prisoners repeatedly referenced the loss of specific individuals as having devastated unit cohesion. When Schmidt fell, everything fell apart. After Müller died, nobody knew what to do. We would have kept fighting, but when they killed Kruger, it was like they killed all of us. The moral implications of this tactical application were never formally debated during the war. The focus was purely on effectiveness, and it was effective. But it raised questions that would haunt several of the program's participants for the rest of their lives. Was this form of psychological warfare ethical? Was there a difference between killing enemy soldiers randomly and killing specific enemy soldiers chosen because their deaths would maximize psychological trauma to their comrades? Sergeant Daniel Geronimo, in a debriefing conducted in April 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended, expressed deep ambivalence about the direction the program had taken. "My grandfather fought the American cavalry for 30 years. He told me once that there is killing in war, which is necessary, and there is murder in war, which is not. I asked him what the difference was. He said killing is when you fight an enemy who has the same chance you have. Murder is when you fight an enemy who has no chance. When I identify an amateur soldier on the battlefield, I'm identifying someone who has no chance. And if we use that knowledge to kill him, are we really any different from murderers? The war ended on May 8, 1945. The Apache observation program was quietly disbanded. Most of the men who had participated returned to civilian life, carrying their experiences in silence. The program was briefly mentioned in a few official histories, usually as a footnote about indigenous contributions to the war effort. The deeper implications of what these men had been able to do, and what they had been asked to do, were never publicly explored. But the knowledge they had demonstrated, the ability to identify amateur soldiers from professional ones through pure observation, did not disappear. It was preserved in classified training manuals, passed down through special operations communities, and studied by military psychologists trying to understand the intersection of traditional combat observation skills and modern psychological warfare. In 1972, a researcher from the Army War College, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, attempted to reconstruct the Apache observation program for a classified study on battlefield psychology. She interviewed 8 of the surviving participants, now middle-aged men living quiet lives on reservations or in small towns across the Southwest. What she discovered troubled her deeply enough that she recommended the study be sealed for 50 years. Her final report, declassified in 2022, contained a single paragraph that explained her decision. The men I interviewed possess a form of knowledge that modern military doctrine cannot accommodate. They do not see combat the way we teach soldiers to see combat. They see patterns in human behavior that predict death with accuracy that seems impossible. More disturbing, several of them report that they still possess this ability. They can look at civilians in everyday situations and identify who is marked for early death. They see automobile accidents before they happen. They see heart attacks in men who appear healthy. They see violence in situations that appear peaceful. When I asked if this ability had brought them peace or purpose, every single man told me it had brought them only sorrow. One of them, Sergeant Daniel Geronimo, told me, "I learned to see death during the war. I never learned to stop seeing it after." The implications of Morrison's research were never pursued. The study was buried in classified archives. The men she interviewed returned to their lives, carrying their knowledge in silence. But the question remains, the question that Major Kenneth Bradley wrote in his journal in 1944, the question that has never been answered. If these men could see death approaching others with such certainty, could they see it approaching themselves? Thomas Nietzsche died in 2003 at the age of 84 in a hospital in Albuquerque. His daughter reported that in his final days, he kept repeating the same phrase, "I can see them all. Every man I marked. They're all still here, waiting." Daniel Geronimo lived until 2009, passing quietly in his sleep at the age of 91. But 6 months before his death, he gave a final interview to a historian researching indigenous contributions to World War II. His last recorded words about his wartime service were, "People ask me if I'm proud of what I did. I tell them I'm not proud, and I'm not ashamed. I did what my country asked me to do. I used the skills my ancestors gave me to try to keep men alive, but I saw things no man should see. I saw the moment death chooses a person, and I learned that sometimes death doesn't choose randomly. Sometimes it's invited, by fear, by despair, by surrender. Every amateur soldier I identified had already surrendered inside. They just didn't know it yet." The last known Apache observer from the program, James Cochise, is still alive as of this recording. He is 98 years old and living in Dulce, New Mexico. He has never given a public interview about his wartime service, but in 2019, a journalist managed to speak with him briefly. When asked if the ability to identify amateur soldiers from professionals was something that could be taught, Cochise's answer was simple. Anyone can learn to see, but most people don't want to see what's really there. They want to see what makes them comfortable. A professional soldier, a professional hunter, a professional warrior. They all see what's really there, even when it's terrible, especially when it's terrible. That's what makes them professionals. The knowledge these men carried, the ability to read death in the posture of a body or the rhythm of a breath, came from traditions thousands of years old. It was not magic. It was not supernatural. It was observation refined to an art that modern warfare had forgotten, then remembered briefly, then forgot again. But somewhere, in classified training facilities and special operations units, the teachings of the Apache observers continue. Modified, adapted, stripped of their cultural context, perhaps, but present. Because once you understand that amateurs and professionals can be identified by how they carry themselves, by how they move, by how they breathe, you cannot unlearn it. And if you walk through the world with that knowledge, you begin to notice something disturbing. The patterns don't end when the war ends. The markers of those who will survive and those who will not persist in every human endeavor. You begin to see them in traffic, in crowds, in the faces of people going about their daily lives. You begin to see that some people are already marked. And you carry that knowledge, heavy and dark, wondering if perhaps you were marked too, long ago, and simply haven't reached the moment yet where the marking becomes real. In this life, we walk through darkness we cannot fully understand. We face battles visible and invisible. But there is a light that no darkness can overcome, a hope that no fear can extinguish. In the book of John, chapter 1, verse 5, it is written, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Whatever we face, whatever shadows we walk through, we are not alone. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ, for He sees all, knows all, and offers salvation to those who seek Him. The warriors we have spoken of could see death approaching, but only God can see beyond death, into eternal life, and only through His grace can we find true peace in a world marked by war and suffering. The story continues. The knowledge persists, and somewhere, someone is watching, seeing what others cannot see, carrying the weight of that vision alone.